on this note, I have one of the eminent speaker here who, before I move on to questions and comments from last year's conference, I would love to welcome the African regional president for of the International Federation of Social Workers, and that is Dr. Noel Muridzwo. So it's a pleasure to have you here. I mean, I know we've both had a whole lot of conversation around African social work, and then I could still remember, I still have memories of my interview with you during COVID-19 when it was really tough for me, many of us, and someone like me working at the same time in the hospital. It was really a very crazy moment. But at the same time, I feel so honored to welcome the African regional president. And I'm so happy that we have the whole African president of all social workers here. It's so interesting. So over to you, sir. Because of our time, over to you. Um, you can make your presentation. Let me allow you to share your screen.
Uh, Maybe I will ask Jacob
Okay.
Rugare
Okay.
to help me to start by acknowledging you as the master of ceremony, Olu, and also to acknowledge colleagues who are joining us. I see Professor Supol is here. Others are also here. I also want to recognize members of the network and colleagues for the work that you are doing. My presentation today will be on social work contribution to socio-economic development of Africa. Perhaps asking the question why, how, and who should be part of this presentation. So I hope. So I am from Zimbabwe with Midlands State University, based in Harare. The university is in a town called Gweru, which I am originally from. So I only came to town to go to school. So I'm honored to work for them. And as I have said, why? Perhaps our starting point is on how we conceptualize and define what social work is. And by definition, we would all agree and use perhaps the IFSW and the International Association of Schools of Social Work's definition of social work. And in that definition, we will find that social work is not just practice-based, it is also an academic discipline, but it goes further to talk about who we are in our DNA, that we issues around social justice, cohesion, relationships, empowerment, and liberation of people are core to us as social workers. Now, how do we liberate people? How do we create cohesion where there is no development, where there is poverty? And if you look at those values of at the core of social work is the issue of emancipating people from poverty, from servitude, from all these social ills, and therefore development. So therefore, we connect the dots and say that social work is intertwined with socioeconomic development, because we that's what we are. And that then also puts social work in a collusion course with with issues surrounding development or lack of that development, because that's what the profession is all about. So we can connect the dots of development and social work in our definition itself. So we are concerned primarily with the vulnerable, the poor, and so we challenge these inequalities in a responsible way, and we do challenge this. I would invite you to read Lombard. I would invite you to read Supol in these arguments. Now, what is then development? Concept. It is more it is really more than just the economic development and economic growth. You and I would agree that the old debates of looking at development in terms of economic growth is background, because it does not translate into development. So it's more than that. It is also the social indicators. It is also to do with what we would call in social work the new emancipatory values of social work. It also has to talk about democracy. It also has to talk about empowerment. Yeah, I'm glad we listened to the previous presentations, where the presenters are also looking at issues to do with women and such things. So development is more. You want to argue and look at it from that perspective. So development is more. And when you look at the concept of development, you also want to appreciate that now we can't talk about development where there is climate change and its effects. So it also encompasses these concepts. So in these arrows that I have put there, I would challenge us all also to then also put in what we call development. It was deliberate, and also to ask this house also to contribute to this discussion, to say what then is development. And I would think that it is more than what I have put there, and you can also put more in terms of development. We can move now to who. Now, perhaps this could also answer the question of who is affected by the underdevelopment, and how these issues or selected social development issues in Africa have affected and have resulted in the underdevelopment of Africa. You look at issues to do with war. Currently, we have disturbances on the continent. We speak of Sudan. We speak of the DRC. We speak of other areas and hotspots on the continent. We also have issues to do with poverty, and poverty has visited our doorsteps as Africans, and how we define poverty could also be different as to how we look at that. And I will leave that for another day, for another presentation. But we also have COVID-19, and how this pandemic not only reflected the issues of underdevelopment, or amplified the divide between the haves and the have-nots, between the global south and the global north, but also within the global south and Africa in particular, where we had glaring issues around COVID-19, including also for persons with disabilities, children and other vulnerable groups, and how they are affected by exclusion. You had in the first presentation the issue about women and their participation, and what social workers can do and what policymakers can do. And these also speak to who is affected by underdevelopment. But when you talk about development and underdevelopment in Africa, you can't also miss to talk about the issues around corruption, and how that has robbed the continent of the needed development and the change in people's lives. But lastly, also issues around climate change. You see how it is impacting the livelihoods of people, and robbing them of their livelihood and a chance out of development. But also, when you speak about climate change, to speak about, yes, we talk about these alternatives to the energy mixes and alternatives, but what are these alternatives speaking to my grandmother in the rural areas? Yes, it's good not to talk about the use of alternatives, but does she have these alternatives for her also not to be left behind in the development discourse and arguments and the development agenda on the continent? So I feel that the question of who should also speak to who is affected by the underdevelopment and who should also be part of this movement as we move to whatever we would want to call development. And we need to have this in our thinking. We can move on to the next slide. Now, this is just to illustrate the point about COVID-19. And here I took this picture from Uhungwe and others. It's contained in a report that they did on a study of COVID-19, and they are developing. There's a journal article. A direct quote from them is that they looked at how women with disabilities were faring under COVID-19 and how it affected them. The next slide is just illustrating the issue around war. And here I took pictures from Sudan. I also took pictures on the internet on the DRC and how people have been moved and how this affects their livelihoods. Now, what is missing in our issues around the development discourse, and what are the issues that we need to also look at when we talk about development? And this slide will speak to will speak to the missing link, or what I would call what is missing in as far development. Can you help me, Rugare, to enlarge? My eyesight is now betraying me. Can you please enlarge that? Sorry. Thank you very much. So by the previous slide, remember I spoke about who. I deliberately left also social workers as practitioners, that we are also part of this development discourse. But what is missing from social work is issues to do with specialization, and also issues to do with specializing in different fields of social work. And this can also be a missing link in social work, where we also might also be missing the specialization. There is also the issue around the exodus of social work on the continent due to many reasons. Here, I would want you to read Mugumbate, where he speaks about social workers moving, and he gives some of the reasons, 4 or so reasons why he says social workers are missing, and what that has an impact on the development agenda, now that we have agreed that social workers are an important ingredient in the development discourse. Now, when we also move further, we find that the training and curriculum, you had Mpedziswa speak about the missing link in social work training, and giving an example of developmental social work in our training and our curriculum. Do we also understand what we call development, and how we conceptualize development, and how we move this issue around development? The issue of further research research in issues that are development oriented. Now, perhaps the issue is not about the research or the missing research. Perhaps it's when we do the research, do we pass this information? Do we have avenues for this information to be consumed? That also could be an issue. But we'll come back to, we'll talk about the African network and how it has also changed this narrative and how this can also be a vehicle. Again, in terms of the capacity building, in business development and entrepreneurial skills, in social workers themselves, speaking again to the curriculum. So there are many missing links from the perspective of social workers. You can also add into the arrows of why you feel, yes, social workers are important, but what is missing from social work is what you can also add in this discussion. So we can now move on to the next slide, where it is then say, how do we do this? Can you move up, Rugare? Thank you. One of the things that I'm arguing that we can include when we look at the missing link is the issue around the Afrocentric philosophy or the African voice in the development discourse or agenda, so which is relevant to social work. I'm glad also Rugare in his presentation, he talked about the initiative that the network is doing. And part of this argument that I'm making is what the network is doing in promoting African knowledge that is relevant to development, that is also relevant to social work intervention on the continent. I then also move on to what Mupenziso was talking about and what he talks about when he talks about developmental social work. You can also read Lombard, you can also read Supol. I'm glad and happy that she's also part of this meeting, and colleagues can also ask her to then also expand what she meant by developmental social work. But basically moving away from remedial social work, but to deal with the problems and nip them in the bud. So that you address developmental issues, therefore you also address developmental aspects and issues for social work. Now, developmental social work will also have the Ubuntu-inspired thinking, what Rugare also presented earlier on, the creating more sustainable livelihoods, but at the same time, not rejecting all past practices. So the argument is, yes, remedial social work would be relevant because we'll also have the need for it, but the emphasis should be on developmental social work. Then I also say on the how part is the issue of collaboration and networking. Now, this brings about the African network and such INDABAs where people collaborate, where people network and exchange ideas. And this is important for us in Africa to share our experiences and also to share our practice experiences and how we have used these in the development agenda, but also in our social work intervention. So this forum, my argument is, we are also contributing to the development of Africa through such dialogues, through such networks, through such forums. So it is important. So we are also doing it. So it's part of the how. How do we go towards the social economic development of Africa? And I argue strongly that it is important. Rugare, can you just go back? I will just run through. The issue about research and publication is also very important, but also continuous professional development is quite important. And I would want to also encourage that this goes on. And why is that important? Because we do have new issues coming up and new ideas, new interventions coming up. So it is important to have continuous education as social workers, that we are important in the development discourse that we are talking about, but also the issue of engagement and advocacy. Earlier on, the first chart that is on this group is about how social workers can also advocate for political and economic policies that is on the chart. And I do agree with with that argument that social workers can also be part of the development agenda through advocacy, through policies. This argument was put forward by Olabisi, arguing that policy formulation should be part of social work, and social workers must be involved in political and economic policies. Yes, of course, social work is a political profession, remember, because we talk to policies, we also talk to policymakers, so we can't hide from that. And also we need to be involved in new trends as social workers for us to promote economic development on the continent. New issues coming up. We now also have issues around climate change and how that is impacting the livelihoods of people. So social work also has to embrace and confront these issues from various angles that I have discussed in terms of the how. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I would say this is a short presentation of my presentation of what we can do as social workers to contribute to economic development of the continent, and answering the question who, what, and how. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muridzwo, the African Regional President. I feel so delighted to listen to you again. It's always refreshing. It always takes me back to my textbook from university. Like, oh boy, remember what you were told back in the school. As a clinician and as a practitioner, I always find it so refreshing when I read Introduction to Social Work. What does it mean? Where do I start from? How do I move forward? It's such a great moment for us today. Thank you so much, the African Regional President. And on this note, I have as the master of the ceremony, one of my obligations is to recognize eminent scholars who are present here in this conference. I have the honor of seeing one of our very prominent professor, Professor Vicente Champol, and then I saw Professor Roderick. I saw so many eminent scholars. We really appreciate your presence here. It means a lot to us.
Mine is not a question, Dr. Mbumbata. It's just a comment to Dr. Muridzwo. Thank you very much, especially for bringing the dimension of development or social work. We need social work to speak to the aspects in Africa, to the challenges in Africa. Our challenges might not be the same in Europe, might not be the same with other first world countries. Therefore, I think it will be very, very important for us to look into how social work can be suited to address the challenges in Africa. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat there from Gibru. Gibru, do you want to ask your question? He's asking how can we contribute to economic independence? How can we contribute to economic development and I think be independent from Western involvement? So I think he's grappling with especially where we get the funding and our reliance or our dependence on Western nations. So how do we actually achieve our own development without really relying on resources from Western countries? Over to you, Dr. Noel.
Thank you very much for the question. Let me also acknowledge Prof. Mpeziswa is here. You see, as his students, I have to answer this very well. Thank you very much. While independence and development, my argument has been, yes, we need economic development, but when we talk about development, it is more than just the economic development. But I do acknowledge that how do we talk about development without also emancipation in terms of the needs and basic needs? And the argument is therefore that development is more than just the economic growth argument that is put, and perhaps the issue around what then the alternatives that Mupedzi Iswai and others have put forward is the issue of developmental social work. And when you look at developmental social work and what it seeks to entail is to try and nip problems in the bud and not reacting to problems. You are looking at addressing the sources and the macroeconomic challenges, perhaps through policies, or perhaps through advocacy, but also in terms of the livelihoods and the issues that are affecting people at the micro level, which those also then as social workers, we start to help people help themselves in terms of meeting their livelihoods in their rural areas where they live. And once they emancipate themselves and work for themselves, perhaps the argument is they are also meeting their needs, but perhaps also development at national or international level. Mugumbate, when he started, and the previous speakers were also looking at how do we strengthen African countries to trade amongst themselves. But remember, the issue of development is not to say we want to do away with linkages with others. It's perhaps how we are doing it. I'm glad others are here. They can also add their voices. Thank you.
Yeah, I have Professor, before we move on to Professor Roderick, we have an acknowledgement from Professor Vashante, who said she enjoyed your presentation, and it's an important thing. It's an important, the important thing is that event like this open space for dialogue and which really resonated with many of us here. And then we've Olabisi Adebayo also says solution to African economical, social, and political problems must be Africa tailored made for Africans. So we've got a question from, is it a question from Promise? Social workers should be incorporated as active stakeholders in the educational system, mostly during the pre and post curriculum design and implementation. Again, decolonizing the alien inherited colonial educational system has become imperative mostly in the African countries like Nigeria, whereby the system is reading in reoccurring crisis. So there is a question from George who said that how do we weave social work into our sub-regional and regional political entities to liberate our continent using the Ubuntu practitioners? So that's a question from George. I'm glad to see George from Sierra Leone, I think. Is that, yeah, I think from Sierra Leone, yeah. I'm coming, Professor Roderick, I'm coming.
Are you acknowledging Prof first? Maybe he could speak, then I come in to address
okay,
how
Prof.
we can, yes.
Okay, Prof.
Maybe if you just take Prof for now so that we continue.
Okay. Thank you so much. Wow, that was a fantastic presentation. You know, I really enjoyed Dr. Muridzо. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. I think you provided a very concise, you know, and straightforward argument there. I was just wondering, you know, we can't talk about development without focusing on the 17 SDGs. And we feel that you have issues, you know, the key sort of mantra, if you like, which says leaving no one behind. And you did talk about climate change and issues around it. And I'm just wondering whether social workers, what role can we play? You know, we talk about about climate change, but somebody in the back of beyond, in some rural somewhere out there, they have not even heard about this term, this concept. And we know that social workers are supposed to be, in all those areas you may find they are social workers. Do you see a role for social workers in educating, the ordinary person, the vulnerable out there, in terms of climate change and its impact, that sort of thing? Otherwise, thank you very much. I'm enjoying listening to the proceedings, and I'm happy to see many faces, people that are supporting this wonderful initiative. And Jacob, greetings to you. Thank you. Okay. Right. So that's my question. Do you see social workers playing any role in terms of this mantra, leaving no one behind? And yet we know that the majority are being left behind as things stand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I'll start addressing George and say, yes, there is a role for social workers, and such networks and coming together as associations, as social workers, gives us a collective voice on the global arena, but also gives us an opportunity to share ideas. So yes, we can as a collective, and I'm glad as a network, we can come together and have a voice, and through the publications, we can also cascade our thinking, cascade our research and our knowledge to the world. So there is a way through collective engagement, and the network is part of that engagement. And I'm glad that let me talk to Prof. Mpedziswa's comment. Yes, social workers have a role to play, but maybe the issue is perhaps they are the ones also who might also be left behind. So the issue around social workers also familiarizing with the concept of climate change becomes important, but also the issue around also the curriculum, adopting these new concepts and how climate change is important, like all other concepts. So we as social workers and also as educators need also to move with the time in terms of the curriculum, because it then empowers the social workers who are practicing, but also in terms of the research. So yes, I agree with you. There's scope for social workers also to educate communities and work with them. But also importantly, I've raised the issue that as social workers, yes, what are the alternatives in the arguments? So what is it that we're giving my rural mother in the rural areas as an alternative? Do we just talk about alternatives to energy alternatives?
We'll stop you now, Doc, who are enjoying the conversation. You can also put a response in the chat.
In the chat. Thank you very much, colleagues. I will also take other comments online, then respond through Rugare and the organizers. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Dr. Noel. Thank you everyone.